It's Friday, February 16th, and welcome to World Review, the Chicago Council's weekly look at the news from around the world. Ivo Dalder is in Munich and actually here with us. I'm Carla Robbins, co-host of the the Council on Foreign Relations, the World Next Week podcast, and I'm a former reporter and editor for the New York Times and Wall Street Journal. Today, we're going to be looking at the state of the NATO alliance as GOP frontrunner Donald Trump invites Russia to do whatever the hell it wants with some of America's closest allies. And the House Republican leadership declares U.S. military aid to Ukraine dead on arrival. We're also going to be looking at the state of the U.S.-Israeli relationship as Bibi Netanyahu seems ready to blow off President Biden's warnings against attacking Rafah in southern Gaza, where nearly 1.5 million Palestinians have taken refuge. We're also going to be looking at the outcome of Pakistan's ugly election. No prime minister there has ever completed his term. What are the chances Shahbaz Sharif, and he was nobody's first choice, will break that dismal record? And we have an on-the-ground report from the Munich Security Council. Here with us to discuss all of these issues from New York, Peter Spiegel, U.S. Managing Editor from the Financial Times. Hey, Peter.
Thanks for having me on, Carla.
From Washington, D.C., Yasmeen Abutaleb, who's the White House reporter for the Washington Post. Yasmeen, it's great to see you again.
Great to see you, Carla.
And from London, Prashant Rao, Senior Editor for Semaphore. Prashant, it's nice to meet you.
Thanks for having me.
And from Munich, our noble leader, Ambassador Ivo Dalder.
Hey, great to be here. And Carla, you're a co-host anytime of any podcast.
She promoted herself.
And one of these days I will be able to do, is this a cold open like Saturday Night Live? One of these days I'll figure out what my job is. Do I work? So who is it? Who am I? Okay. Ivo, can we start with you? Can you give us the scene in Munich? What's everyone talking about there?
It's a strange idea. So first thing, the news that was rolling across screens early this morning of the death of Alexei Navalny has put a bit of a dumper on the atmosphere here. As it turned out, his wife Yulia Navalny is in Munich. I just bumped into Mike McFaul, former ambassador to Russia, a good friend, and he said he had dinner with her and her daughter last night, and they were talking about how they were going to continue to resist and do everything. And here she was shortly after the vice president spoke. She came to a standing ovation in front of the hall and said, my first inclination was to go home to be with my kids, and then I thought, what would Alexei do? And Alexei would fight, and that's what I'm going to do. So it just sort of underscores the brutality of the regime that we're all dealing with. It was here actually in Munich in 2007 that Vladimir Putin first really announced his desire to take on the West and NATO and the United States, and in some ways to reestablish the Soviet Union, which he a few years before had said was the worst geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, the end of the Soviet Union. And now he's been trying to reestablish it in one form. And that's the real thing that's going on here. There is a deepening concern. I'd call this more an insecurity conference than a security conference. A deepening concern that the countries in Europe, but also from around the world that are coming here, are increasingly worried about how Russia, but also China and others are taking advantage of the absence of the United States. And we've had times and times discussed about this, but the reality that the United States is, under the current president, so far unable to get the critical aid to Ukraine is letting people ask the question, can we still rely on the United States? And then, of course, the reason the aid's not coming through is because a presidential candidate doesn't want it to happen and he's stopping his party from doing it. And that presidential candidate may become president again. And we're talking about Donald Trump. And so all of a sudden, everybody is talking about Trump-proofing Europe and Trump-proofing NATO and Trump-proofing the global order for this. And so that's what this is all about. How does the world get on without the United States being an active partner, and in some ways, under Trump, perhaps being a much more destructive force than certainly has been the case for the last 75, 80 years. Remember, the conference itself is is about the transatlantic relationship. It's celebrated its 60th anniversary this year, about the strength of the transatlantic relationship, and NATO's had its share of crises. We've all written the headline "Whither NATO?" ? Many times. It really feels that the transatlantic relationship is moving in a different direction right now. So that's the main topics of conversation here.
Ivo, can I ask a question? So, in anticipation of the conference, they release this report every year, and part of it is this Munich Security Index, which has polling in it. And you guys, of course, do really great polling as well. And this year, Russia was no longer the number one concern for most of the countries. They on the list was immigration was the number one concern, and radical Islam. Now, of course, it was done right after the Hamas attack, so let's put that one aside. Is that not actually representative of what people are talking about? Is it really Russia and not this this questions about migration, which seem to have totally seized the American public?
Yeah, well, so remember, there's not a lot of people from the general public at a conference like this. This is the hoity-toity. I call this the Academy Awards of security policy wonks. This is not your average Jane and Joe who come here. Other than thousands and thousands of police that are standing around, but they're not participating in this conference. So I think immigration clearly is a politically incredibly salient and important issue for the publics, and has huge political impact, as you see here in Germany. But in this, exclusive, shall we call it, elitist place that I'm standing for 4 days, it is people who do security policy as a business. It's the prime ministers and foreign ministers, and they're worried about the larger questions about order and how's the world organizing itself in a way when it is being challenged, both from below, when democracy is being challenged and people are challenging elites, but also from above when the United States is no longer there.
Ivo, can I just ask you to go back very quickly to the Navalny news? And I know it's only a few hours old, and you've probably just done some chit chat on the sidelines there. But I'm curious. I was actually at the 2007 event there in Munich when Putin spoke, and the U.S. was always represented by what we would only call the Reaganite Republicans, right? It was a delegation largely led, congressional delegation by McCain and Lindsey Graham, and Lindsey Graham's not there this year because Lindsey Graham has suddenly become a Trumpista. And I just wonder if there's any hope in amongst the delegates, particularly the American delegates, that this Navalny thing is such a shock to the conscience that these old Reaganite Republicans who have disappeared both from Munich, but frankly also from Capitol Hill, may decide to be more vocal and more present in the Ukraine aid debate, or is this a tragic event that is going to have no impact on any policy positions?
You're right that this was the grandstand for the three amigos, right? John McCain, Joe Lieberman, and Lindsey Graham would come here every year for the last 25 some years, and take a whole bunch of people from Congress. They take 2 airplanes, they fly over, and this was seen as a way to, at least for those who didn't have passports, to get a passport, members of Congress, and spend time here. So I haven't actually seen the full delegation list, but my sense is the delegation consists of those parts of both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party that remains very much tied into the belief in alliances. It is striking that Lindsey Graham canceled 2 days ago. He has been a fixture on this here for so long. And John McCain, who is revered in Munich, and there's an annual dissertation prize. There's a John McCain reception, a really big reception every year, and he used to be the superstar of this event from the United States. The idea that Lindsey Graham doesn't dare to come to what was his, one of his most important annual visits because he has turned into someone who doesn't even believe his own shadow. Or is afraid of his own shadow because of the change that Trump has pushed him into. It's a very sad sort of commentary on the state of affairs in the Republican Party. I must say. Now the good news is, those who did come, they care deeply. I'm sure that they will take back the news of Navalny and the move into Capitol Hill, and that includes members from the House. They arrived this morning, so they flew overnight. I haven't had a chance to see any of them yet, but I'm sure that they're going to come back with a recommitment for the importance of making sure the United States remains involved. Certainly hope so. So I got to run, and you've got a show to run, Carla. It was fun to join.
Bring us something fun, okay? Bring us toys back.
Toys. Okay. Well, they don't. Yes. Boeing is here. No, I don't want to get there.
A couple of Hellfires. That's all we asked for. Yeah.
Bring us a door plug. Okay.
Hey, have a great show. Good to see you all.
We'll look forward to hearing. Thanks, Evo.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye. So moving on from there, thank you. Okay. Well, Peter, to continue with that and that your question, which is, this really isn't the first time that Trump, has suggested that he wouldn't live up to the Article 5 commitment. Why do you think this, had such a big reaction? It really landed with a lot of force. And do you think it's going to change the political dynamics? Because it wasn't just that. There's also that news that the White House didn't want to get out about this prospective space weapon that, could wipe out all of our communications.
Yeah, I mean, you have a series of
a Republican head of the House Intelligence Committee.
I mean, it's interesting. We were just discussing this internally within the newsroom about, Putin seemed to be winning the month, the year, and this was the first week where suddenly things started going wrong for him. Right? You have, I just saw in my email box, you have a very oddly strong statement on Navalny from Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, who has been incredibly weak-willed on Ukraine about the need to move forward to back Ukraine in light of Navalny. You have the space nuclear weapon disclosure. You have the Tucker Carlson weirdness, which I think has had a lot of a backlash amongst some Republicans as well. And now you have Navalny. And I just think there is suddenly a week where the master strategist, Vladimir Putin, begins to lose the snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. Now that may be overly optimistic, but to get to back to your original question about why this landed with such a noise, because as you said, when he was president, I mean, he was repeatedly belittling NATO but I think we sort of, what I think is going to happen over the course of the next 7-8 months as we get to the general election is I know everyone in the Democratic Party in particular is incredibly worried about age and polling numbers and whatnot. But I think over the course of the next 6 to 8 months, people start remembering that Donald Trump was a problematic president, and your average American by the end of his term was not well pleased with him, and he was not popular, particularly after January 6th. And I think this is part of that process. Him coming out again, we sort of forgot about it for 4 years, but him coming out again and literally inviting the U.S.'s biggest rival to do what they want with treaty allies, I think could have an ameliorative effect on some of the polling numbers that Biden has suffered under. It does also just remind us about how Trump conducted foreign policy. It's incredibly transactional. He the art of the deal. He thinks everything is some sort of big real estate deal, and then everything's about money. The geopolitics doesn't really matter. If I can get these people to pay money, that's exactly how foreign policy is conducted. So it was a reminder of where he comes from. The only other thing I will say, though, to sort of almost counter their argument, is we have to remember that isolationism is, dating back to Robert Taft, is a strong strain in American foreign policy and in the Republican Party, and frankly, amongst the American public. And what we have seen over the last 5-10 years is an increasing resistance by the vast majority of Americans to "quote unquote" foreign adventurism. Right? There was a lot of support, frankly, despite the fact it was botched, for pulling troops out of Afghanistan. There was a lot of opposition to yet another Middle Eastern war by the U.S. The other thing also I would say is, Trump, if we take away his belief that somehow a treaty obligation is voluntary, which of course we all know is wrong, I have to say his rhetoric, both as president and now, has had an effect on the Europeans because they are spending now. And I've been covering this issue for 20 years. I remember. I think actually Eva was there. Robert Gates' last speech on a foreign stage was in Brussels at NATO, where he said, look, we are of the last generation that fought side to side with our European brothers on this landmass. You're going to have a whole generation of Americans coming up who do not remember that. You guys are going to have to start spending to defend yourselves. So that was the Obama administration, and frankly, Gates is also Bush administration. So it is not a unique thing for Donald Trump to come out and say, "Hey, Europeans, you have to spend more on your defense," and in his own bizarro way, has in many ways convinced the Europeans to start spending closer to 2%. And I think that the data which they're going to release maybe this week in Munich is that 18 of 31 will now reach the 2% threshold, which again is not a bad thing. So I guess it's a little bit of Trump, as per usual, has always gone over the line of what is acceptable behavior on the international stage, suggesting that the NATO treaty obligation is voluntary is obviously not. However, he is reflecting something that is a strain in American history and American population right now, which we have to take into account. And B, I got to say, to give the guy credit, the Europeans have suddenly stepped up. So there is a mixed bag here, and I think we have to sort of acknowledge that as well.
So, Prashant, the UK defense minister said yesterday, it's not Donald Trump, it's Vladimir Putin. And he also said to everybody else, you got to step up and do your 2%. Like, Trump actually sort of refers to these sort of like greens fees, delinquent greens fees. They're actually not dues to NATO. It's 2% of GDP. But the UK also announced on Thursday that it's going to lead a coalition of European countries, including Turkey and I believe France, to increase this defense industrial capacity to replenish stockpiles at home and continue support to Ukraine. How seriously should we take this? Are the Europeans finally beginning to develop their own defense capabilities? Because one of the biggest problems is, even if they are willing to spend more money, they really don't have the capacity to produce what Ukraine needs. They need a lot more artillery. They need, they need Patriot missiles. They need things that have not been produced in Europe.
Yeah, I think in the seeds of your question is really along what timescale and to what extent are we answering this question? Because we may be seeing a 5 to 10 year shift in how Europe sort of does become a sort of bigger defense industry. Peter's newspaper today had an interview with Ursula von der Leyen, where she says that Brussels wants to incentivize a bigger, sort of more boisterous European defense industry. There's a Finnish-Swedish defense manufacturer that's switching to, 5 times daily shifts. So they're producing sort of shells 24 hours a day. So there is this kind of stuff. It's just, I think it's hard to grasp that, this is not going to move the needle anytime soon. This is not the kind of thing that is going to ensure that Ukraine wins in 2024. It may well be the kind of thing that ensures that in 2026 or 2027, because, this war may well last that long, that, the Russian military industrial complex can eventually be defeated. But Europe on its own, admirable though it is that it is, stepping up and spending more on its own defense, is not going to be enough on its own. And really, I think, neither, frankly, would the United States. It actually requires a kind of enormous commitment from both sides of the Atlantic, emotionally as well as financially, to this kind of long slog of refashioning economies, not just to gird against, not just to build up a defense complex, but to gird against the kind of power that Russia does have on the energy sector, on the sort of supply chain system, on eventually, relations with China. I mean, the multitudinous impact. We could talk about the defense base being built up in Europe, but I mean, frankly, it's unfortunately something of a drop in the ocean in the huge shift that is required both in Europe and the United States, economically as well as politically.
The other thing I'll just add to what Prashant said is there has been discussion within Europe about, okay, if we can't produce it in Europe, let's use European funds to buy American weapons. And Emmanuel Macron, perhaps in a traditionally French position, says, no, if we're going to buy, we use European money, we have to buy European weapons. And so there isn't even an option of actually, if they can't produce fast enough in Europe, of going to an American company and asking for the weaponry, which has also hindered the European efforts.
I mean, you do see, I guess, some shift in East Asia that is also somewhat notable. South Korea is becoming more of a defense manufacturer. Japan is sort of loosening its rules on Patriot transfers. But again, I just don't think it's moving the needle.
Yeah, I want to get Yasmeen in here, and I do want to move on to Bibi. But Yasmeen, how much panic is there in the White House about this? Do they have a plan B? Because as we all know that, the Senate finally got it together. They passed this $95 billion bill, 60 of it for Ukraine. And then the House said dead on arrival. Do they have a plan B here?
Not really. There's not much that they can do without the huge infusion of cash from Congress and the military aid. So they can look within the agencies, within DoD for sort of stopgap measures to help, but there really is no substitute for a big aid package that has to go through Congress. So, they can maybe ramp up production, find, some ways through the agencies to send a little bit more military aid to Ukraine, but there really is no backup plan or really like a credible alternate plan beyond the congressional package to send Ukraine the aid it needs for another year. And when you talk to U.S. officials, they've sent these messages publicly too. They say Ukraine is already in trouble. Like, they had said the money was going to run out in December, and that now the soldiers on the front lines are really hurting. They don't have enough ammunition. I think they're very concerned about Russia making significant gains during this massive gap in funding. And it does not seem like the House is especially inclined to take up the bill and pass it. I mean, they all live in fear of Donald Trump. And I think the conversation earlier about Lindsey Graham not going to the Munich Security Conference was so illustrative of that, that I don't think anyone's willing to sort of stand up and say, this is the right thing to do, so we should do it, especially because most of their base doesn't seem to agree with Ukraine aid anyway. Like, no one's made the case in a very compelling way. And so you've seen public support for it massively drop off, which I think is another huge challenge here.
So we could talk about Ukraine for the entire time, but there is another, just horrifying conflict going on out there, and that's Gaza. President Biden, and Yasmeen, let's stick with you here. President Biden likes to describe himself as the most pro-Israel president in history, and until recently, I don't think that was hyperbole. And you've been writing really great stuff, great and frustrating and awful stuff about the increasing strains in relationships and the relations between Bibi and Biden. Are the folks in the White House talking about doing more than issuing these increasingly strong public admonishments? And are they going to do it?
It's a great question. I mean, right now, every indication is that the president is just not willing to go there. He's not. And I think there is a lot of frustration among some of the White House people who are supportive of the White House, but critical of this bear hug strategy and continuing with it for so long. I mean, we're in month 5 of this conflict. I think there was a sense that the White House was getting something for it in the first few weeks of the war, that, there's been a lot of reporting that we and others have done on how close Israel got to launching an attack on Hezbollah and opening up, a much more problematic war and warding that off. Of course, Israel, the White House likes to talk about this a lot, didn't want to allow any aid in the beginning. They've gotten them to allow some in. But I think on the aid issue, it's important to note that 500 aid trucks were going into Gaza before the war started. And right now we're under 200 in this dire humanitarian situation where, about half the population is on the brink of famine. So it's not a lot to celebrate. It's obviously better than nothing, but it's just kind of a drop in the bucket. But I think, there has been a lot more questioning of what are they getting for this, not criticizing Netanyahu publicly. What exactly are they even able to influence in private? And I think the answer is, in the last several weeks, what we've seen is they're not able to influence very much in private anymore. The aid issue has gotten worse. They're getting in less aid because Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, these right-wing cabinet ministers, and Netanyahu's government have sort of found more ways to throw sand in the gears when it comes to aid deliveries. And, they oppose the current hostage deal that's on the table, which, Netanyahu walked away from discussions this week. And that was, of course, a source of enormous frustration for U.S. officials. But I think the real tension here is that the U.S. does have considerable leverage if they want to use it, but there is no indication that the president wants to use any of the leverage. So they're willing to sharpen their rhetoric some. The president obviously called it over the top, but they're not willing to do things like slow weapons sales or weapons deliveries or even threaten to condition aid. Like, they've made very clear that they oppose all that. And critics of this strategy will say, as long as Netanyahu knows he has this sort of blank check of support, we had Ben Rhodes in our story saying this, as long as he knows he has a blank check of support from the U.S., the sharpened rhetoric isn't going to do anything. He's going to keep proceeding ahead. And with this Rafah operation impending, the White House has said they oppose it without a credible plan to evacuate people, which I think there's also question as to what that means, because you have 1.5 million people crammed into a tiny corner. But they've also made clear that they're not going to do anything or impose any consequence on Israel if they move ahead with it.
Yasmeen, can I ask you to follow up on this? I mean, it's a very dangerous place to be, is trying to get in Netanyahu's head, but just to push you a little bit on that. To what extent is Netanyahu's policy about domestic politics as well, because there is always been a bit of a narrative that once the war is done, or at least that there is a ceasefire, they're going to have to go to elections, and he's probably going to lose. The other one I just wanted to ask is in the last conversation about Ukraine, there is this shadow of Donald Trump over everything. And what we know is, although there's been some nasty rhetoric between the two of them of late, this is almost an axis of Trump in the Middle East now, right? You have the Saudis and the Netanyahus and the Emiratis all sort of waiting for Trump to come back because they love him. And this relationship with the Kushners and Netanyahu goes back for decades. Is there a bit of playing for time that if he plays up the clock a little bit, A, he doesn't have to face a domestic political election, but B, Trump comes and saves his bacon because Trump will seem to do whatever Netanyahu wants because of his cozy relationship with him?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, there is a growing sense within the White House and within the administration that Netanyahu is only looking out for himself and his own political survival. And what they'll say in private is the war maybe is not good for him, but it's not bad for him either. And, he doesn't have a ton of interest in trying to end it as quickly as possible. But I think domestically, there are two things he has to contend with. I mean, there is enormous anger at Netanyahu that he doesn't seem to be prioritizing the release of the hostages, that he walked away from these discussions. There is this growing sense within Israel. He was unpopular before October 7th, even more so since, but that he's not prioritizing getting the hostages out, which I think is what a lot of Israelis want him to prioritize. But then at the same time, he can't afford for his coalition to fall apart. And so you see him responding more and more to the right-wing ministers in his cabinet. And Israel has moved further right just in general since October 7th. What U.S. officials will tell us is it's not like if you get rid of Netanyahu, you suddenly have this government that's ready for a peace deal with the Palestinians. Like, he is pretty representative of where most of the country is at right now.
So, Prashant, Secretary Austin, the defense secretary, was warning, they were warning maybe this privately, but he came out way back in December and said, you can't win a war if you kill a lot of civilians. We learned that lesson in Iraq. How are people outside, this sort of, I think of this as Holmes and Moriarty going over the falls together. I mean, how are people outside looking at this war in Gaza? Are they just sort of throwing their hands up and saying this is something the Americans have got to deal with? Or is this, a recipe for generations of more terrorism and generations of more human suffering?
Yes, to all of that. I think that sounds like exactly what I feel like is happening right now. And beyond that, actually, I think this is the kind of thing that is going to lead to a generational reshaping of politics as well. In sort of quasi-centrist political parties that have so far been able to espouse, the Washington consensus of liberal values and human rights, sort of the Labour Party in the UK, which is, I think, really struggling with how to balance a Palestinian Arab British population that is, understandably extremely frustrated with how Britain is, Britain has much less power than the United States, obviously, but how Britain is sort of taking this. And, similarly, Arab Americans in the United States, who are a huge and important voting bloc, who are, I think, very disaffected. So, I think we can talk, of course, about the potential violent implications of this, but I think the political implications are huge and will span generations in ways that I don't think are the case for the Ukraine war. I actually think the Ukraine war was a very different political calculus than this one is, because I do think this reshapes how centrists view their centrist party on an issue that has been generational in narrative sort of framing when it comes to the Western consensus of liberal values, human rights, and freedom and democracy.
If I can once again disagree with Prashant, but just to add to it, because I think when history judges this period, I think there will be a question about who's to blame for exactly the dynamic that Prashant is saying, where centrist, particularly center left parties, are suddenly finding their electorates, their base, abandoning Israel. And I think a lot of the blame has to fall at the feet of Benjamin Netanyahu. And I don't think we've had enough examination of that. I mean, a lot of, if Israel had a single most important foreign policy priority over the last 70 years, it is ensuring bipartisan support for the state of Israel, particularly in the US, but also in Europe. And he has single-handedly destroyed that by first, I'm always surprised about Biden's embrace of Netanyahu, because we don't forget he was the guy who showed up in Washington and almost actively campaigned for Mitt Romney, and then also showed up on Capitol Hill at the invitation of the House Republicans to shove it to Obama. This is a prime minister who told his population that he understood the West, who embraced Donald Trump, who embraced the Republican Party, and surprise, surprise, the center left worldwide hates him now. So I just think there's sometimes a discussion about why the left has abandoned Israel, and I don't think there's been enough blame laid at the feet of Benjamin Netanyahu. I think for the decades now, as Israel's most singular important leader, he has done real damage to Israel's foreign policy by losing and undermining support across the left, and even the moderate left now, which doesn't seem to be abandoning him.
But Yasmeen made the point. I mean, the Israelis, a lot of people in Israel got that before October 7th, and October 7th changed, the psychology. What happened was so horrifying that, people pulled together. And interestingly, Obama got it. I mean, Obama used to talk about how he just had to get through, that couldn't deal with Bibi because Newt Gingrich told him that, that he wasn't going to get reelected and no need to deal with him. But Obama, loathed Bibi. But Biden, Biden was of a generation in which it was Israel right or wrong. And he doesn't seem to, are the people around the people around Biden, Yasmeen, are they just totally tearing their hair out and think that they just can't change the president's mind, or are they with him on this?
I think it's a mixed bag. I think when you talk about his senior advisors, they're pretty much where he is. So when you think of like Tony Blinken, Brett McGurk, Jake Sullivan, I think they're pretty aligned with where the president is. And that I think that point right now is that they are enormously angered by Netanyahu, but don't really want to exert the U.S. influence to try to really force him to change. But I think if you're talking about the government more broadly and some of the lower level aides who are not necessarily in that inner circle, I think a lot of those people are tearing their hair out. That why has the U.S., stood by Israel unwaveringly since I think it made sense in the wake of October 7th, but that I think the tide started shifting pretty quickly in the first couple of weeks of the Gaza war, just because you saw, residential buildings and just enormous civilian casualties, and even what Biden described at one point as indiscriminate bombing throughout the territory. And so I think, Biden's senior aides seem to be pretty aligned with the strategy, and are sort of in the same place. In our story, we did report that some of them do want him to be more publicly critical of Netanyahu, and Biden seems more willing to do that, albeit carefully right now. And I think also part of that, Prashant touched on this, is, Biden sent his senior aides to Michigan about I guess it was just last week. And I think they are starting to reckon with the real political problem they have too. Officials have said, oh, wow, people think we don't care enough about the Palestinians and we need to make sure we reflect that in our rhetoric. So you've seen that shift as well. But I mean, I think also a key point of frustration here is that the longer this war goes on, the worse it is for Biden politically. And now, Netanyahu has to tend to his own domestic politics, and Biden needs to start worrying about his.
Yasmeen, can I just ask what you think the Biden people think the most dangerous thing is in domestic politics, if I can word that probably better? I mean, obviously you mentioned Michigan, which is obviously a swing state. There's a huge proportion of Palestinian Americans who live in Dearborn and in the surrounding area. So there is the sort of Arab-American vote that Prashant referred to. But there also, I guess, there is a sense that a lot of the shock troops for the Democratic Party on the ground in swing states are just young Democrats. And are they worried about that as well? That sort of the college kids and the recent graduates who will show up in swing states and knock on doors like that they won't show up? Or where do they see the politics of this, the danger in the domestic politics on this one?
Yeah, I think actually they're more worried about young voters than about Arab Americans. I mean, Arab Americans are an important group, but they're a small group. They have sizable influence in Michigan. But when you're looking across the map, I mean, the election's not just about Michigan. They need to win Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and a number of other states that are going to be tightly contested. So I think they're more worried about waning enthusiasm among young voters and voters of color, just because that is a bigger group that they need to energize. And I mean, even before all of this, they had serious problems with those groups. And so I think this is just adding to it. And, you know, we've also talked to lots of voters who have said they might vote for Biden, but they're not going to volunteer for his campaign the same way they may have 4 years ago, or who are really thinking about sitting it out or voting for a third party candidate. So I think when you're looking at the just domestic electoral politics, it's a number. They're not only talking about Arab Americans. They know they have problems with a pretty key part of the Democratic base.
So I apologize. I keep popping in and out, but it's very windy where I am. So the internet seems to be popping in and out. It's, you know, the third world infrastructure of Connecticut. So we need to move on. We have 10 minutes, and I really do want to get to Pakistan. This is just sort of elections are never pretty in Pakistan. And these were always going to be messy, especially the most popular candidate. And he was the military's former darling, but turned into their nemesis, Imran Khan. He was in jail. He was barred from running. His party, they stripped them of their symbol. Most of his allies ran as independents, and everybody said they were going to do terribly, and they did remarkably well. Everybody also knew that it wasn't going to make a difference, and that they predicted a Sharif was going to get the job. They just thought it was going to be Nawaz, and it ended up as his younger brother, Shahbaz Sharif. Does this anti-Khan coalition have enough credibility to do anything? This is a country with a hell of a lot of problems and also a lot of nuclear weapons.
Yeah, I guess, basically, I don't think they have that credibility among there's no electoral mandate. Obviously, the numbers are pretty clear. It's remarkable given the scale of the establishment push against Imran Khan and the PTI that they managed to secure as many seats as they did, despite the various legal and political hurdles. I think actually, Pakistan is also interesting, not simply because of what has happened, but because what it represents in it's too easy to cherry pick global trends, but Pakistan is, this particular election really symbolized the confluence of several of them. One of them is, the Economist Intelligence Unit this week had this whole thing about the erosion of democracy worldwide. The only place that had improving democracy was Europe. And by their metrics, it was by 0.01 on their scale of 10. So it's barely. Everyone else's democracy was eroding. Pakistan kind of embodies that in a lot of ways. The greater kind of army role in the election, the sort of seemingly politically mandated sort of targeted charges at Imran Khan, etc. But also, Pakistan's sort of really flailing financial situation, which is worsened by the cost of girding against climate change, its worsening fiscal situation, its relationship with the IMF, also gets at this. And then just more deeply, I'm struck by, Imran Khan, you can critique him for a million different things, right? But he was the most popular candidate. And the alliance of establishment parties to hold the line against a popular politician is something we've actually seen around the world. And I think, not in sort of Western Europe and in many different countries. And it doesn't end well, because it sort of suggests that actually this whether or not this election was free and fair, and, there are many indications that it wasn't, it sort of speaks to this notion that the establishment doesn't want our candidate. So it's not going to actually reduce divisions. It is going to amplify them, because now supporters of Imran Khan and the PTI are even more convinced that the game is rigged, and that the democracy in Pakistan, which flawed though it was, has really remarkable kind of characteristics that have held the line. Like the Pakistani press is still incredibly impressive. That all of these are eroding. I would highly recommend. There's this great piece by Musharraf Zaidi in the News, in which he really talked about the deeper loss that is happening in this country. That how can you trust a mandate to people who didn't win an election, and what happens when you deny the undeniable? It was a really fantastic piece. Well worth reading on this, I think.
But Prashant, can I ask you to sort of take that a little bit further? Because what is your view of what actually does happen? Because what passes prologue, what usually happens is chaos in politics, and then the military steps in and says, "Okay, enough of that, start over." But there's been, as you said, such a clear rebuke of the military's preferred direction, because they did not want Khan to be successful. That even that might be destabilizing. But I know it's probably impossible for you to predict. But I'm just curious where you think this might go in terms of if there is such displeasure amongst Khan supporters, that there is continued violence, and does the military step in, and does that in any way solve things?
And because last year was their worst year in, I think, more than a decade in terms of terrorist deaths. And then you also had, them shooting off, the Iranians shooting off, they have their little tit for tat thing going on. I mean, there are also actually some hot activity going on.
Yeah, I'm fairly downbeat, as I think would be the sort of reasonable sort of position, just because the fiscal situation in particular in Pakistan, the economic situation is really, I think that's actually the most troubling of all of these things, because it gives the government so little room for maneuver. With a sort of struggling GDP, Pakistan's military has an outsized portion of the budget and of GDP for a country, for its economy, its size. It plays a huge role in the economy. And so, I think the smart money would be on, military isn't going to relent on its role. It hasn't shown a history of doing so since the 1970s, and arguably before that. Why would it do so now? And so, none of the trends in Pakistan, or indeed, other countries that have experienced similar electoral situations, none of the trends indicate that this ends terribly well in the medium to long term, whether it's disaffection among PTI supporters and Imran Khan himself, or the army using it as an excuse to further undermine democracy, as it has, in decades prior. I'm not sure what is, at the moment, a positive trend out of this election, except for the fact that this party, remarkably, just refused to bend against all of these various strictures. Again, you may disagree with Imran Khan on a million different issues, but his supporters have stuck with him despite him being jailed, despite the party being blocked, and innumerable other obstacles, real and tangible and intangible.
The one thing I'll just add to the negative scenarios that Prashant has presented is there is a bit of a history of the Pakistani military ginning up external threats to solidify support at home. So, there's some interpretations of the Mumbai attacks that was ginned up by the ISI to sort of remind everyone we're still here and gin up domestic support. And so, one of the other dark scenarios, which I can imagine, is them picking a fight with India over Kashmir or something else to again spur up nationalism and national unity internally to shore up their support, which would be, I guess, good for them domestically, but obviously problematic for the world for geopolitical reasons.
Well, that's a cheery thought.
That's what I'm here for, Carla.
Particularly, the Indians exercise a huge amount of self-restraint in those conditions, but there's much less self-restraint going on in India these days. So, Yasmeen, you deal with so many crises over there in the White House, and you think about sort of the ebb and flow of American interests. I mean, there was a time in which Pakistan was an obsession in Washington, and when people would say to me, why should we spend a moment thinking about Afghanistan? I would always say, what's next door to Afghanistan? It's Pakistan, and they have, all these nuclear weapons. And do you have anyone mentioned anything about Pakistan in your hearing in the last few days? I know that the Americans and the Brits have both said there should be an investigation of this election. There were irregularities, but that has certain sort of pro forma tone to it.
Yeah, they seem very careful to not be weighing in too strongly here. And, I heard from some sources that there is a rising level of anger among a lot of Pakistani Americans that the White House hasn't sort of weighed in a serious way here, that if they do recognize the election, that there's going to be, a sort of not uprising, but just a lot of anger in that community. But to be honest, I think the White House has just been swallowed up, like many administrations, by the crisis in the Middle East. So I have not heard anyone mention it besides the pro forma statement that you mentioned. And I think all their time is being swallowed up by dealing with Israel and the very volatile situation. I mean, they seem extremely, extremely concerned about a Rafah operation, because the implications of that also are, Egypt is fortifying its wall with Rafah and not wanting a huge influx of Palestinian refugees to come in. And then, they're still trying to get the Ukraine money with not a lot of success. And so I think they have these two wars that they are really sort of not boots on the ground, but directly involved in a very serious way. And like you said, I don't think it's the obsession that it once was. I'm sure among the people who do, Asia policy, it's top of mind, but just in terms of covering the White House, and I kind of jump from crisis to crisis. I'm not deep in the weeds on specific ones. I have not heard it come up in a really serious way.
So I suspect, Pakistan may very well be back on Evo's menu, and you all will be back soon talking about it. But let's hope it's not as bad as Peter said. That's it for this week's edition of World Review from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. I want to thank Prashant Rao of Semaphore. Prashant, it's great to meet you. Yasmeen Abutaleb of the Washington Post, and Peter Spiegel of the FT for what was a great conversation. And I'd want to thank Evo, who's back off in the rooms of power in Munich. And Ivo, he will be back here next week, and we hope to see you all there then. And in the interim, stay safe, everyone. Thank you guys so much.